This video is on how to find the midpoint. So let's talk about what exactly we're doing when we find the midpoint, and then we'll see if we can turn that into a formula to make it easy. So let's start with something easy. So we're starting, let's say we're starting at 3 miles, and you're going in a straight direction, and let's say you're going to school, which is 11 miles. Alright, so you want to see how far is it from 3 to 11. So first, what do? We see, okay, how far, or what is the halfway between 3 and 11? So what is a midpoint? So we'll start, we figure out what is the distance from 3 to 11. So I'm going to do 11 minus 3, and I'm going to get 8. And then if I divide that by 2, we'll get 4. Alright, so halfway between 3 and 11 is 3 plus 4, which is 7. Okay, so what happened was, let's think of it this way. We had 4 miles here and 4 miles here, because these are 8 miles apart. From 3 miles to 11 miles, they're 8 apart. We have 4 here and 4 here. If we do 3 plus 4, we get 7. Okay, so let's just look at it as numbers. Let's say we had 3 and 11. How can I find the number that is halfway between 3 and 11? And there's a way to do that called the mean. So we can find the halfway, can find halfway by using the mean. And if you remember from statistics, to do the mean, we add the two numbers together, or add how many numbers there are together, and divide by how many there are. So in this case, we're just doing 11 plus 3, and we divide by 2. And that's 14 divided by 2, and we get our 7. Okay, so that's easy to do if we have, if we have a flat line. But what if we also have a y-coordinate to deal with? So let's look at one where we have both an x and a y. Okay, so here I've drawn a line segment, and we're going to try to find out what is the midpoint of this line segment. So first we want to figure out what are the endpoints. Okay, so I have the first endpoint is that x is 1 and y is 1. And then the second endpoint, we have x is 4 and y is 7. Okay, so we're going to do it just like we did for the previous one, except this time we're going to do it for both the x and the y. So let's start with the x. I want to figure out what is the half the distance between 1 and 4. So I know that if I have two numbers, I want to figure out what is the point halfway between them. I'm going to take the mean, so I'm going to do 1 plus 4 and divide it by 2. And that means that the y value is 5 halves, or 2 and 1/2. Or the x value, I mean. Alright, so for the y value, I'm going to do the same thing. Except this time we have from 1 to 7. So I'm going to do 1 plus 7 divided by 2, which is 8 divided by 2, which is 4. Okay, so the midpoint is when x is 2.5 and y is 4. And if I'm going to plot those points, all I have to do is figure out where x is 2.5, which is right here, and then y is 4, which is right here, and where those two intersect, it's right there. So this is our midpoint. Okay, so we now have enough information to make our formula. So remember, what we did was we took the x and the y, we found the mean for each one, and that became our x and y coordinates. So as a formula, to find the mean when you have two endpoints, you just add them together. So let's do the x first. So x1 plus x2, and we divided it by 2, and that gave me my x coordinate. Then did the same thing for the y coordinate. So we did y1 plus y2, and divided it by 2, and that gave me my coordinate pair for the midpoint. And that is called the midpoint formula. Okay, here's an example. So we're asking, what is the midpoint from negative 4x and 9y? So this would be x1, this would be y1, to 8x and 7y. So that's x2, and the 7 will be y2. Alright, so let's put those in the formula. So first what we do is we find the mean from negative 4 to 8. And that means we're going to do negative 4 plus 8 and divide by 2. That's for our x value. Then we'll do our y value. So we're going to do 9 plus 7 divided by 2. Negative 4 plus 8 is positive 4. 9 plus 7 is 16. So we end up with 4 halves and 16 halves. When we simplify, we're going to get our midpoint, which is 2x and 8y. So that is our midpoint. All right, let's try another one. Here we have example 2. We're going from x1, which is 10, to x2, which is negative 7, and then y1, which is 9, to y2, which is 1. Alright, so let's start with the x. So 10 plus negative 7 divided by 2. And then the y would be 9 plus 1 divided by 2. Alright, so let's do 10 plus negative 7 is the same as 10 minus 7, so it's 3. So we're going to get 3 halves. 9 plus 1 is 10, so we're going to get 10 halves. Then when we simplify that, it's going to be 3 halves and 5. That's the midpoint. Alright, what about this one? Here we have an endpoint and a midpoint, and they're asking us to find the other endpoint. So what do we do for this? Well, we're going to kind of do it the same way, except we're going to work backwards. That means we're going to have to do a little bit of algebra, but don't worry, it's kind of easy algebra. And so let's start with the x. So let's start with x, because we're going to have to do x and y separate again. So for the x, what happened was I took negative 2, That's our first endpoint. I added it to my second endpoint, which we don't know. And then I divided it by 2, and I got my midpoint, which was 5. So we'll just kind of work backwards with that. And the first thing I want to do is get rid of this nasty fraction. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 2, like this. That's going to get rid of this. And we'll get negative 2 plus x equals 10. And then all I have to do is add 2 to 10. And we'll get x is 12. So that's our other endpoint, the x value. And now we'll do the same thing for the y. Alright, so for the y I went from negative 9. That's where I started. I added some y value to it. Or I added the other endpoint y value to it. I divided it by 2 and I got 3. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing, multiply both sides by 2. I'll get rid of these 2's, and we'll get negative 9 plus y equals 6. Add 9 to both sides. And we'll get our y value of 15. So the other endpoint is 12x and 15y. Alright, let's try another example. So this time I have an endpoint at 10 and 2. Midpoint is 1 and 3. I want to figure out what is the other endpoint. So let's start with the x. We're going from 10. We're adding it to something we don't know what it is. We're dividing it by 2, and we're getting 1. So we multiply both sides by 2. And we'll get 10 plus x equals 2. Subtract 10. And we'll get x is negative 8. Okay, so the x value is negative 8. Now for the y value, we're going from 2. We're going to add something to it, and we'll get 3. I can already see it's going to be a 4, but let's go ahead and work it out. So we get 2 plus y. We're going to divide it by 2, and then we'll get 3. Okay, so let's do multiply both sides by 2. And we will get 2 plus y equals 6. Subtract 2 from both sides, and we'll get y is equal to 4, and it looks like I was wrong. So it's actually 4. And that makes sense. If you go 2 to 4, midpoint's going to be 3. And coordinates are for this one. The endpoint is at negative 8 for x and 4 for y.